Hey, have you ever tried? Yeah, have you ever tried to ask why the prices of rice increases from around 30 pesos per kilo 10 years ago to 42 to 55 per kilo nowadays? Or have you wondered why the fare in the PUB, PUJ has increased? Or maybe have you ever think why the fee in the barbershop increased? Well, all your questions, all your concern is all about inflation. Inflation is the sustained increase in the general price level of goods and services. And it is normal in the economy. Inflation, or the increase of the general price level in the economy, is a normal phenomenon. In this reason, this week we are going to discuss about inflation. Why does inflation occur in the economy? Why does general price level increases? What are the factors that cause the increase of the general price level? And of course, the types of inflation. In this lesson, you are all expected to be able to discuss inflation and its causes. And you are all expected to be able to differentiate cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. And lastly, you are all expected to be able to evaluate the causes of demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. Before we go any further, let's define first some related terms. Inflation, as mentioned, it is a sustained increase in the general price level. Again, sustained increase. How about if there is a sustained decrease in the general price level? Is it possible? Yes. And that is what we call deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. Deflation, again, it refers to the sustained decrease in the general price level. Anticipated inflation refers to the expected increasing trend of the general price level, meaning the inflation which is already expected by the consumers. It is brought by the first increase in the cost of production and or the change or increase in the tax rate imposed by the government. So that's anticipated. It is already expected inflation. Next is the unanticipated inflation, the opposite. In this case, consumers are not expecting an increase of the general price level. This is brought by a calamity or any other uncertainties that occur in the economy, such as typhoons, earthquakes, pandemic, tsunami, and other form of uncertainties. It will result to increase in the general price level. So it is what we call the unanticipated inflation. Next is the stagflation. Stagflation is an economic condition wherein there is a high inflation and high unemployment rate. High inflation and high unemployment rate. It is a rare situation because inflation and unemployment is too contradictory, two opposing variable. But in this case, during the stagflation, unemployment and inflation go the same way. It's increasing. So that's stagflation. Hyperinflation. From the prefix hyper, this refers to the inflation which is rapid, excessive, and out of control. Inflation is normal in the economy, but when it becomes out of control, it becomes now a hyperinflation, meaning it is no longer in a normal situation. Naturally, hyperinflation measures more than 50% price increase per month. So it is an not so good or worse economic condition that can be happen in the economy. So that's hyperinflation. Okay. Types of inflation. There are two types of inflation. First is the demand pull inflation, and the other one is the cost push inflation. So let's discuss first the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is the sustained increase in the general price level due to the changes occur in the demand side. What are the factors that contribute to the demand pull inflation? First, the increase of the aggregate demand. Let us recall the law of supply and demand. If the demand increases, price increases. Therefore, if the aggregate demand of the economy increases, it will result to the increase in the general price level. So it results to a demand pull inflation. Next, if there is an increase in the disposable income, meaning our income will increase and we are more capable to spend more, to consume more, then aggregate demand will increase. Therefore, again, it will result to demand pull inflation. Third, demand pull inflation happened when there is an increase in purchasing power, meaning if you and I and other consumers in the economy can consume more or can increase our spending capability, then it will result to an increase in the aggregate consumption. Therefore, it will increase the aggregate demand. Then again, it will result to demand pull inflation. Any changes or any increase in the aggregate demand of the economy will result to demand pull inflation. Next is the decrease in the tax rate. How does tax rate decrease affects or contribute to demand pull inflation? Imagine if your family receives 20,000 pesos per month and the government is taxing you or your family of around 10%, and the government decided to decrease the tax rate, for example, the implementation of the tax reform acceleration and inclusion law, the tax rate decreases. Then it gives additional disposable income to the consumers. Therefore, the purchasing power of the consumers increases. Then it results to the increase in the aggregate demand, which result to the demand pull inflation. Next is the decreasing or lowering of the cost of borrowing. This refers to the borrowing of money by the business firms from the bank. How does this happen? If and when the banking sector or the BSP decreases the interest rate, the cost of borrowing then will decrease. Therefore, the business firm will be encouraged to borrow money from the bank. Then, there will be a massive business expansion. Again, if and when the interest rate is lowered, the business sector will be encouraged to borrow money from the bank, and there will be a massive business expansion. And please remember that business expenditure or investment expenditure by the business firm is a component of the aggregate demand. Therefore, if there is an increase in business expenditure or investment expenditure by the business firm, it will result to the increase of the aggregate demand will in result contributes to an inflation or the demand pull inflation. Lastly, seasons or occasions. How does seasons or occasions contribute to demand pull inflation? During enrollment, parents tend to buy more school supplies. Well, this will result to the increase of prices of the school supplies. Seasons or occasions again. During Christmas season, it is our tradition that during Christmas season, we tend to celebrate, we tend to do festivity, we tend to spend more during this season. Therefore, aggregate demand will increase. There is a movement of our aggregate demand in the economy. That is why inflation takes place. And this type of inflation is demand pull inflation. It is a type of inflation caused by the movement of the demand side of the economy. The next type of inflation is the cost push inflation. If the demand pull inflation talks about the movement of the demand side of the economy, the cost push inflation talks about the movement of the supply side of the production in the economy. What are the factors contributing to the cost push inflation? First, if there is an increase in the price of raw materials, we can expect that the cost of production increases. Therefore, the aggregate supply will decrease. As a result, price will increase. Remember, production cost will be added to value added. Again, production cost will be added to the final price of the product. That's why if there is an increase in the prices of raw materials, we can expect that the price of the final product will also increase. And that's one of the example of the cost push inflation. It is an inflation caused by the change of the prices of raw materials, which result to the increase of the price of the final goods or services. Second, increase in the salaries and wages and other employees' benefits. Take note, if there is an increase in the salaries and wages of employees, the business firm will then increase the price of goods and services just to cope up the increase of production cost. Again, if there will be an increase in the salary and wages of the employees and other benefits such as SSS, PhilHealth, or etc., this will cause an increase of the prices of goods and services of that affected firm. Therefore, the increase of salaries and wages and other employees' benefit will increase the production cost, decrease the aggregate supply, and increase the general price level. That's the reason why economists and government sometimes is adamant or hesitant to increase salaries. Before a salary increase will be implemented, a thorough study will be conducted. What would be the effect of the salary increase in the salaries and wages in the economy as a whole? Because again, any change in the salary, any increase in the salaries and wages will result to cost push inflation. Next, if there is an increase in the price of gasoline, there will be a cost push inflation. Why? You may ask why. It is because most, if not all, of the production use or consume gasoline. That's why if gasoline's price increases, production cost also increases. Therefore, aggregate supply lowered or decreased and prices of goods and services increases. Again, that results to cost push inflation. Next is if there is an increase of rentals. Example, a company A is renting land or building for its production here in Bukidnon, and the rental fee is increased. That marginal cost will be charged or added to the final price of that good and services. That's the reason why it contributes to the increase of the general price level. So again, it's one of the example that contributes to cost push inflation, the increase of rentals of lands and buildings used for production. Currency appreciation. If the Philippine peso appreciate, it has some effect to the production side of the economy. Why? Because we are importing raw materials. Those imported raw materials as import to production, the import price increases, therefore the cost of production increases. As a result, the aggregate supply tends to decrease, and or the final price of goods and services affected by that imported price will be increased. That's why currency appreciation affects the economy in the form of cost push inflation. Next, increase in the tax rate. If and when the Congress of the Philippines, especially the House of the Representatives, pass a bill and signed into law by the President increasing the tax rate on production on business firms, that incremental or additional tax burden by the business firm will be added to the production cost. Therefore, to make that firm running, that additional cost of production will be added to the price of the goods and services. That's the reason why the general price level increases. There is an effect. There is a negative effect if and when the tax rate increases. Next, if there is a cutting off of production incentives, there are LGUs, there are local government units that provide incentives to production other than those provided by the national government. Tax holidays, tax perks, tax incentives, production incentives. If these incentives will be cut off by the government, then the burden will be passed on to the consumer in the form of increasing the price level. That's the reason why if production cost is terminated, there will be an increase, a sustained increase in the general price level. So that's one of the example of cost push inflation. Then, if there is a decrease of the aggregate production output, this refers to the productivity of labor. If an industry or if the economy employs no or less technology, the production efficiency of the economy will be decreased. Then, the cost of production will increase. Again, if there is an increase in the cost of production, then we can expect an inflation or an increase in the general price level. Again, if we talk about an increase or movement in the supply side of the or in the production side of the economy, then we are talking about inflation, which is cost push or cost push inflation. Well, aside from those mentioned causes of inflation, there are also other causes of inflation. What are these? If you notice in the picture shown, floods, tsunamis, fire. This is the eruption of the Taal volcano. So, this gives you the idea. Calamities is one of the other causes of inflation. If the economy is experiencing severe calamities, then we can expect an inflation to occur. Why? Because the supply side will be affected. Next, if there is war, unrest, riots, or if there is a problem in the peace in order, we can expect an inflation to occur. Again, production is affected if there is a problem in the peace and order situation in the economy. Next, if there is a problem or difficulty in transportation, For example, in today's pandemic, there is a difficulty in transportation because the transportation system is being banned or somehow managed, or shall we say, there is prohibition. There is a difficulty in transportation, then the transportation cost is increased. That is why, since the transportation cost of goods and services is very difficult, it results to an increase in the general price level. For example, before the COVID pandemic came, the transportation cost or the fare from Davao to Malaybalay is just around 200 plus, I think. Then when pandemic came, it's somehow doubled. It's around 350 or just like that. So there is a difficulty in transportation. Same thing with transporting of goods and services. If there is a difficulty in transportation, then we can expect that general price level will increase. So again, difficulty in transportation is another cause of inflation. Here, the profit motive of the business firms. This refers to the mindset of the business sector to earn more or to set markup. Business firms operate in the free will subject to the terms and conditions prescribed by the law, but the main objective of the business firm is to make profit. Then, because of their motivation, the profit motive, well, it can set price to the extent that is allowed by law. Then, therefore, the motivation or the profit motive of the business firm will cause an inflation. I am sure you are familiar with these pictures. This is during IDSA 1, during the Marcos time, and this is during the IDSA 2. Both IDSA, same scenario, different situation, different time. If there is a public unrest or public disobedience rather, it will cause an inflation. It will cause an increase in the general price level. Why? Because the production sector is being affected. People, as one of the input to production, is no longer in their production site. They are going out there, rally against the authorities, then temporarily stop production. Then the supply side is being affected. The aggregate supply decreases, then inflation comes in. Again, that's the reason why public unrest or public disobedience to the sitting authority is one of the causes of inflation. Another one. You can see here many people or many consumers are buying things in the grocery store, while the other picture here, it's next to zero. There is no available goods sold here, meaning there is a panic buying because people are expecting inflation to come. Inflation expectation will cause an inflation. Why? Because there is a spike in the aggregate consumption. If the people are into panic buying, the aggregate consumption will spike, will increase. Therefore, it will affect the normality of the supply side because the demand side increased rapidly. Then, that's the reason why inflation expectation somehow affect the normality movement of the economy. That's why inflation expectation cause panic buying and will result to inflation. If you remember the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an announcement of lockdown. Then because of that announcement, people are buying more rice. Then what had happened? The price of rice goes up. The price of alcohol went up. The price of PPEs went up because people are expecting that the price of these goods will pick up, will increase in the short range of time. That's why they buy more goods while the prices are low. So again, inflation expectation will result to inflation. Now let's have the comparison between the demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. As mentioned a while ago, the cost push inflation talks about the movement of the supply side. That's the reason why the graphical illustration shows a movement of the aggregate supply curve, while the demand pull inflation talks about the movement of the aggregate demand side. So let's start with the cost push inflation. The basic of graphing at the x-axis are independent variable, the general price level, and at the y-axis here is our output, our dependent variable. This is also the real GDP. So aggregate supply 1, because aggregate supply 1 here, so there is a corresponding general price level 1 and y1. When the general price level increases, or when inflation, cost push inflation takes place, the general price level increases from GPL1 to GPL2. Look what happened to the economy. The real GDP decreases from Y1 to Y2. What does this mean? During the cost push inflation, the economy contracted. Again, if a cost push inflation happened, the economy contracted because the real GDP decreases as a result of the increase of the general price level. There is a movement of the supply side, a shift to the left because of the cost push inflation. On the other hand, in the demand pull inflation, again, we will now be talking about the aggregate demand side of the economy. That's why the graphical illustration shows a movement of the aggregate demand from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2. What is its implication? aggregate demand one curve here, the colored blue. Therefore, there is an equilibrium situation at GPL1 and Y1. And when demand pull inflation occur, meaning the general price level increases due to the movement in the demand side, the aggregate demand shifted to the left, to the right. For example, the aggregate demand increases. It is there is an increase in the demand in the aggregate demand. Therefore, the aggregate demand shifted to the right. Then what happened? Since the aggregate demand shifted to the right as a result of the increase in the general price level from GPL1 to GPL2, look at the level of output. It also increases from Y1 to Y2. So, what is the implication of the demand pull inflation to the economy? During the demand pull inflation, the economy expands. There is an expansion in the economy when a demand pull happens. Again, economic expansion takes place during a demand pull inflation, whereas during the cost push inflation, the economy contracted. That's the difference between the demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. That's precisely the reason why our authorities, before they make moves, before they implement programs, before they implement laws, they conducted a thorough study, because any movement or any change in the administrative function of the government will affect to the economy. Clear? So let's recall. Have we delivered the objectives of this lesson? First, have we discussed inflation and its causes? I think yes. Inflation is the sustained increase in the general price level, and we all know now the causes of inflation. And we are able to differentiate the cost push inflation and the demand pull inflation. During the demand pull inflation, the economy expands, and during the cost push inflation, the economy contracts. Then we now able to evaluate the causes of demand pull inflation and the cost push inflation. Should you have any concerns or matters to be clarified too, then feel free to ask questions. Don't hesitate, don't be shy. So just PM me or just send me a message. Let's clarify things. That's all for this week, and that's all for inflation. Thank you and have a nice day. Keep safe.